Hey folks, and welcome to iWizard. So today I'm going to be taking you through a list of my all-time favorite novels. That is 15 books that I love dearly, that I consider to be personal favorites. Stay tuned. All right, Jordan here. So I'm going to jump right into this list, but first I want to go over a couple of ground rules. First things first, this is a list of my personal favorite fiction novels. This is not a list of what I think are the greatest novels ever written. These are not the books I would choose, for example, if New Criterion magazine put me on a panel with other critics and said, please choose the 100 greatest English language novels ever published or something like that. This list is going to be a lot closer to a desert island list. So what I'm saying is that these are the novels I just love to read. They're important to me. They resonate with me. They're my personal favorites. They're close to my heart for a variety of reasons. And I could read them over and over again. Okay, so there's a big difference between these two things. As an aesthetics nerd, I could go into that, but I'll just keep it short and say that they're like my favorite restaurants, right? My go-to restaurants. They're not necessarily all Michelin 5-star restaurants that serve truffles and beluga caviar and Kobe beef, though some of these are going to be high art. But some of them are also going to be burger restaurants and hole-in-the-wall pizza joints and greasy diners, to stretch the metaphor. Rule number 2, no repeat authors, much as I'd like to, because I'd rather get a variety of authors on this list. If I include an author on this list, you can assume that I enjoy his or her other works, okay? But no repeat authors for this list. Rule number 3, no plays, poems, poetic epics in dactylic hexameter, if you know what I mean. No creative nonfiction or anything that could be construed as nonfiction literature. And lastly, if you're wondering why in the heck does he like these novels best and not X, Y, or Z novels that you like, it's highly likely that I haven't read those novels that you've read yet. So let me give you an example. I haven't read, much to my shame, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I haven't read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I haven't even read Moby Dick. For goodness sakes. So I do have, like everyone else, some glaring holes in my literary education, which is one of the reasons I started this channel, and it's why that you'll see as of 2023 on my thumbnail, because I imagine that eventually this list will change as my taste changes, as I read more books that come to replace the books that are on this list. So this is as of 2023. These are the books that are my favorite desert island books. So don't be offended if your favorite book isn't on this list. You certainly can create your own list, and I hope you'll tell me in the comments section what I'm leaving off this list, what you think my favorites should be. All of that is fair game, but I just wanted to let you know this will be a very personal, sort of taste-oriented list. All right, without further ado, we're going to start with number 15, and that is Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. So I told you there were going to be some burger joints on this list. Jurassic Park was not only a staple of my childhood, having been born in 1987, but it's also just a really great hard science fiction novel. When you mention Jurassic Park, say at a party or something like that, people tend to think of it as this unserious thing, as this Spielbergian pop cultural phenomenon. Maybe even they might think of it as something for children. But Michael Crichton was a brilliant guy and a really terrific thriller writer. He came up with the idea for Jurassic Park apparently in graduate school when he realized that if we ever did make the massive investment into genetic research that you'd have to do to de-extinct Jurassic era dinosaurs, the motivation would probably come from a desire to entertain rather than something that you invest in for the sake of progress or for the sake of helping people. Anyways, Jurassic Park is really 3 stories. The first, obviously, is the thriller aspect. Bioengineers and geneticists have figured out how to clone extinct dinosaurs, and they've made a park to keep them in, and the whole thing is secret. So there's this suspense of, will the park open as scheduled? Will Dr. Hammond succeed? Will Grant and Ellie and Ian and the others, will they survive the park, or will the dinosaurs eat them? Will Nedry be able to steal the DNA so that he can sell it to another company that will reverse engineer what Hammond's doing? When will the public realize that dinosaurs exist and that they've escaped off the island and are killing children? So there's a lot going on in terms of suspense. Then there's the thematic exploration, and it's roughly the same that Mary Shelley's going after in Frankenstein. Is the park a good thing? Are Hammond and his team doing something immoral? Has science been taken too far? Is it outpacing morality? Can human beings become the masters of nature, or will nature always win in the end? And the third story here is really about the history of these various sciences: genetic engineering, biotech, paleontology, and dinosaur hunting, and really our past attempts at de-extincting animals. And just in general, the long-standing paleontological debate over whether dinosaurs were cold or warm-blooded, were they lizards or birds. So there's a lot of science history here too. Another debate I find fascinating in this story is this question of how human beings should view nature. Is it beyond us? Are we part of it? Is it our right to control it? Or should we live like Rousseauian noble savages and just pray to nature in this very primitive way, not trying to interfere with it too much, praying for its fertility and bounty, and kind of fearing it in this really Rousseauian way? So what is our role in nature? Okay, number 14, we have Contact by the late astrophysicist, cosmologist, and overall science popularizer Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan is one of the few public figures in my lifetime where it feels truly apt to call him a great man. You know, just one of those world historical figures that was just larger than life and was just a one-man institution. And it's interesting because Contact is probably one of the accomplishments that Sagan is least well known for. When you think of Carl Sagan, you think of his book Cosmos, which really was just a companion piece to his 1980 PBS show, which, by the way, is one of the greatest feats of science communication, science media ever produced. It may, in fact, be the greatest educational television program since Kenneth Clark's Civilization, A Personal View, which Carl Sagan based his series kind of off of that. Anyways, I'm digressing. The story follows the main character, Ellie, from her youth as a precocious little girl who's just learning how the world works, to becoming a young scholar, to eventually becoming a brilliant scientist who graduates from MIT and then works for SETI, which is the Center for Extraterrestrial Intelligence in New Mexico. And she spends her life essentially listening to these radio telescopes, and she's trying to discover and struggling to discover alien life. She just sits there all day listening to these radio telescopes and struggling to get funding and trying to make the whole thing work. And eventually she becomes the head of SETI. And of course, she's really just trying to find her father deep down, who passed away when she was in middle school. And so obviously what happens is that just as Ellie is becoming desperate, just as she's about to give up, she knows it's mathematically and statistically just ridiculously improbable that she'll ever hear anything, given the vastness of space and the fact that we're such a tiny blip on the cosmic time horizon. Just as she's beginning to think that she'll never make real contact and she's wasted her life, at this very moment she hears something. And so the rest of the novel is about first confirming that she has indeed discovered an alien transmission, and that it's not a hoax like all the others. There have been pranks and false positives. And secondly, there's the whole question of what the message says when she receives it. Will they be able to decipher it? Because it turns out that this message is a palimpsest and that there's a secret message hidden underneath. And so will Ellie get credit for her discovery, or will someone steal it from her? Because this thing is no joke. What these aliens are sending us is the instructions for designing a futuristic machine that's far beyond our level of technological sophistication. I'm not giving anything away here. This is like back of the book stuff. And they want us to use this machine to visit them. So this book has elements of both hard and soft sci-fi. How do we decode this message? Will Ellie's team be able to do it, or will another team get there first? Will we be able to build this machine? Who are these aliens? Where do they come from? Are they violent or peaceful? Are they like us? If they're contacting us, they must be vastly more intelligent. So what can we learn from them? Can we trust them? Which astronauts from which nations will get to go on this first contact voyage? Do we as Americans feel the need to get there first because of security and defense reasons? So Ellie has to navigate all of this. And what makes this book so unique is that at the same time, Sagan explores much wider questions. You get to see how Sagan thought humanity would react to learning this news. What will the religious response be? Would religious people see this as a sign of the apocalypse? Or would they see alien contact? Would they see a message from above as evidence of God's existence? So Sagan just asks the right questions, and this is one of the first contact novels out there that I would say I've read that hits every note, pitch perfect. And the ending is spectacular, by the way. And it's a little bit different from the film. So if you've seen the Zemeckis film, definitely read the book. The ending is quite a bit different, even though there are a lot of similarities. Okay, number 13, A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. You can see my nice Folio Society edition, Dance with Dragons, brand new. So I am looking at this series like Lord of the Rings and considering it one giant unfinished book. I've made 3 or 4 videos on Song of Ice and Fire at this point, and I'm about to do a video on Storm of Swords with NIKKI that you can check out. So I'm not going to say much here in addition to what I've already said, except to mention that this series is so incredibly well written. The world of Westeros and the larger world of Essos are so totally compelling. The characters are unbelievably well wrought and deep and idiosyncratic. I've never read another work of fantasy that feels as convincing and as real as this one does. You feel like you know the characters and you care about their plights. Just the Machiavellian politics and the lust for power and the corruption that Martin writes about. It feels like if you took Succession, the television show, and dropped it in a medieval setting, and you added dragons and knights and maesters and white walkers and powerful gods, that's what reading this series feels like. And just how famously brutal Martin is with his characters, and that only adds to the realism and the verisimilitude, and you get the sense that nobody is a paragon of moral virtue, nobody is untouchable, everyone has a dark side, everyone has a price, and this is a world where to be the most virtuous person in the room is to put yourself in danger. So this series really does prove Machiavelli's point that in order to do good things for people as a ruler in a broken world, you have to know how to play the game. A leader has to know how and when to be bad, and even more importantly, who they can trust, who they can really count on. And lastly, I'll just say that Martin is such a great prose writer. It's one of the things he's actually underrated for. Not underrated, undermentioned. People don't mention this enough, that Martin's prose is beautiful and rich, and he pays attention to aesthetics. He can wax poetically about nature, about food, about women's dresses and the armor of knights. And so I just never get sick of this series. It is so good. It's the best fantasy out there. At number 12, this will be a new one for a lot of folks, I think, and that is The Elegance of the Hedgehog by Muriel Barbary. I just love this book so much. When it first came out in 2006, it was a total publishing phenomenon, and it feels like now you don't hear as many people talking about it, which is unfortunate. It was made into a relatively successful film in 2011, but again, I rarely hear any buzz about this book on BookTube, and yet I think this is a book that is going to have a revival and it's going to have staying power. So the author, Muriel Barbary, was a French philosophy professor. This book is actually translated from the French. And the translation is marvelous. So this story is a bit hard to describe, but basically you have two main characters. One is a woman named Renee. She's a concierge at a wealthy apartment building in Paris. The other main character here is a precocious 12-year-old girl named Paloma, and she lives in the building, and she is the privileged daughter of one of the residents. And so the story goes back and forth between the two narrators, Renee and Paloma. Renee is from the country. You know, she didn't get a good education, so she has this sort of unassuming job as the concierge of this building. But she has a secret. And her secret is that she loves knowledge. And so she lives this secret life in her apartment. And so when she interacts with people in public, she acts like this dowdy, sort of uneducated rube. But that is all a front, because when she closes the door of her apartment, she has this secret thirst for knowledge. She is this autodidact who is constantly learning and reading and consuming high art and great literature and philosophy. And she's got this whole rich inner life that nobody knows about, where she has basically educated herself. And she's the type of person who wants to improve herself and to learn about the world, and to find little dabs of beauty in the world through art. But at the same time, she wants to keep this all a secret, because she has this facade. She keeps the TV on in her little living room area so that the residents think she's watching trash TV all the time, because she's ashamed. But she really just uses this to hide. And she's in the back room learning about the great conversation of history. And she keeps this a secret because she feels like people could never understand. And she knows that she'd never be accepted by this upper class society in Paris and by the people in her building. It would just be regarded as unseemly that a concierge should be interested in high culture and knowledge. And so she's this self-taught, very cultured, erudite woman, and yet she lives in her own little world. The only people she really sees are the residents, and then there's this Portuguese migrant cleaning lady who comes in once a day, and they have tea and stuff like that. And then on the other hand, there is this 12-year-old girl, Paloma, soon to be 13, and her story is told in the form of a journal. She's recording her story and all of her deeper thoughts and reflections, and she's coming from sort of the opposite end of things, because she is one of the residents and she's wealthy, but she has a similarity with the concierge in the sense that she too doesn't really want people to know what she's thinking, because she has this whole take on life that, life is absurd and banal and is fundamentally meaningless. So she's got this sort of emo teenager's sense of nihilism and ennui, and she really doesn't think there's a point to anything. And so she's decided that when she turns 13, she's going to set fire to her apartment, and she's going to commit suicide. This little 12-year-old girl writing in this journal, planning her own suicide. And so the story is her sort of counting down to this fateful birthday of hers. And so she's very thoughtful, and she has this kind of Camus, Sartre, Kierkegaard sort of voice as a character. And so while, yes, she is got a teenager sense of life, she's also brilliant and too smart for her own good. And that sort of thing. And so what ends up happening is that another person, a retired Japanese man, moves into the building and gets an apartment. And this is like the first time anything has changed in this apartment building. This is the first time anyone has moved in anyone's recent memory. And he kind of shakes things up in both Renee and Paloma's worlds. And what's interesting is that another thing that Renee and Paloma have in common is that they both have an interest in Japanese culture and aesthetics, Paloma is into manga, and Renee is into Japanese film. So there's a bunch of digressions on art and film and Japanese culture and existential philosophy. And what's cool about the novel is that the characters are very separate, and then slowly over the course of the book, the three of them end up coming together and changing each other's lives in this really beautiful way. And all kind of revolves around this interesting, strange, different Japanese man moving in and shaking up their lives. So check that out. Up next at number 11, we have Dune by Frank Herbert. Dune by Frank Herbert. Here it is. I won't say too much about this because I already made a lengthy video about Dune. I'll link to it in the comment section. But I've said it before and I will say it again. Dune is easily the most important thing to happen in science fiction in the 20th century, and you can't overstate that. Dune is to science fiction what Lord of the Rings is to fantasy. Dune demonstrates, perhaps more than any other book, the power that science fiction has to wow us and fill us with awe and transport us to other realms. And this book in particular showed how you could do elegant world building on a truly detailed, unparalleled scale. And I'll say this too, Herbert is probably the person in science fiction who is most responsible for single-handedly shaping what the genre would become. He weaves in history, culture, religion, politics, military drama, prophecy, environmentalism, all sorts of stuff. Another thing that Herbert is good at is throwing just dozens of really big ideas into his book. You have a civilization that has overthrown its machine overlords and spread itself out into space. You have the geriatric spice melange, this very rare substance that is super valuable but can only be found on one fraught planet. You have shield armor and force fields, which means that people have to fight with swords and knives. You have human computers called mentats. You have this creepy Bene Gesserit sisterhood, which is like this eugenic cult of only women dedicated to controlling the bloodlines. You have the Spacing Guild and the Chom Monopoly and the Landsrad and the Family Atomics. You have giant sandworms and Fremen people in this exotic Arabian-style culture. You have the Missionara Protectiva and a big, fat, evil, pedophile bad guy who floats around on suspenders. And all of this is set against this very Byzantine backdrop of culture and house politics. So there's just so much originality here. And it's the kind of book that if it didn't already exist, I cannot for the life of me imagine pitching this to some publisher. The entire premise just sounds ridiculous, but again, I will quote the late literary critic Harold Bloom, who thought that what made a book great was its idiosyncratic strangeness. He defined that as, quote, a mode of originality that either cannot be assimilated or that so assimilates us that we cease to see it as strange. And that is exactly what Dune did. This book is so odd and freaky and wild that you can barely fathom it as you're reading it, and yet it's got its own kind of strange logic, and you kind of get it too deep down, which is why this book won the Nebula and Hugo Awards. The book is kind of dense and it's very complex, but there are so many great scenes, a very exciting plot, excellent characters in Paul Atreides, Lady Jessica, the Duke, and a truly great bad guy in Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. Absolutely the grandest epic in science fiction and one of my favorite books, a must read. Up next, we have Disgrace by J.M. Coetzee. So this is one I had read in college twice. This book was assigned in 2 different classes, and I think I read it a third time a few years later. This won the Booker Prize, and it's kind of what you would expect from the title. This is ultimately the story of a man's utter shame and disgrace and his ultimate fall from grace. It's about a 52-year-old professor, David Lurie, who teaches romantic poetry at a university in Cape Town, South Africa. So David is this old school professor. He's divorced. He doesn't really understand this new generation of students. They don't care about the material. They're lazy and entitled. They believe in nothing, and they're very transactional. And so David clashes with the college's politically correct environment. Not to mention, this is post-apartheid South Africa, so there are some ways in which people don't really care about what this guy is teaching. He is filled with desire, but he's also solitary and cynical and lacking in passion in some ways too. He is trying to write an opera based on Lord Byron, but he always postpones the project or finds some excuse not to work on it. He visits a prostitute every week and says he has, quote, solved the problem of sex rather well. The main character here really reminds me to some degree of the main character of Camus' The Stranger. But anyways, the prostitute leaves him and he ends up having an affair with one of his students. And as a consequence, his entire life falls apart. He loses his job in what becomes a huge scandal. His friends disassociate from him, and his ex-wife thinks that he's pathetic. I'm not giving anything away. This is back of the book stuff. And so he ends up reaching out to his daughter, Lucy, who is like the one remaining person he has a decent, if strained, relationship with. And he moves in with her on her rural small holding in South Africa, where there's a lot of violence and racial complexities. And so I will not reveal what happens out there, but I will say that while this probably sounds like a miserable time, I find this book to be utterly gripping and brilliant. J.M. Coetzee is one of the best prose stylists just ever. He's easily, now that Cormac McCarthy has passed away, he's easily one of our greatest, if not our greatest living novelist. This book is amazing, and I'm not quite sure how Coetzee is able to craft a masterpiece like this. The prose is so immaculate and crisp. There's not a word that doesn't need to be there. And Coetzee won the Nobel Prize in 2003. He's won 2 Booker Prizes. And again, this is one of the few books out there that, like, you couldn't change it in any way to make this book better. It was like created in a lab to catapult an already great author to the status of a Nobel Prize winner. So check this one out. All right, number 9, The World as I Found It by Bruce Duffy from 1987. This is a great novel, and what's unique about this is it is what you might call biographical fiction. Some people have even called this a nonfiction novel. There's really nothing in here that didn't actually happen, though some of it is extrapolated. So this is the story of some of the great minds of the 20th century. The 3 main characters are Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, mathematician, and social critic; Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher and mathematician, who was an uber genius from one of the wealthiest families in Vienna. Bertrand Russell himself called Wittgenstein the, quote, most perfect example I have ever known of genius as traditionally conceived, passionate, profound, intense, and dominating, which is pretty great coming from another genius in Russell. And then the other main character here is G.E. Moore, who was a good philosopher in his own right, but really is somewhat like the sidekick to these 2 mega geniuses, sort of a Basel to Bertrand Russell's Sherlock Holmes, or a Boswell to Russell's Samuel Johnson. So the cool thing about this book is that it's not just a chronicle of these people's intellectual lives, but their love lives and their circle of friends. So you've got really juicy scenes with very influential figures like D.H. Lawrence and members of the Bloomsbury Group. So this book does a really good job of capturing the essence and the zeitgeist of the early 20th century intellectual scene, and the sort of intellectual ferment that animates that time period. You go to Vienna in 1900, you get scenes from World War I, the colleges at Cambridge. You're talking to Lytton Strachey and Lady Adeline Morel, and the characters are just living in the moment. They're taken up with the debates and questions of their time. There are World War I combat scenes in here that are just beautifully written and brutal. So even if you don't know a lot about philosophy, or philosophers, if you're an even remotely intellectually curious person, if you have an interest in the so-called great conversation of history, this is one that is not going to let you down. Joyce Carol Oates actually said this was one of the best novels ever written, for what it's worth. All right, number 8, The Corrections by Jonathan Franzen. So I love Franzen's writing. He and David Foster Wallace were a big reason that literary fiction and modern realism made a comeback and sort of reached the mainstream again in the early 2000s. I remember being a big fan of the New Sincerity movement in like 2008 and 2009, and Franzen was definitely a big influence for me. You may remember him for his kerfuffle with Oprah. It had to do with the fact that he didn't like the fact that Oprah chose to include the corrections in her Oprah book club, and that he had to have an O featured on the cover of his book. You can see it right there. So you can look this up if you don't remember this. He was worried about his work becoming too mainstream, I guess, and commercialized. So anyways, The Corrections is a sort of family drama, family saga, but it's not super multi-generational or anything, so it has a very modern feel as well, but it's also got a sprawling 19th century quality to it too. The book chronicles the story of a mother, Enid, who is trying desperately to get her 3 grown children to come back to St. Jude, Minnesota for one last Christmas together. And it's one last Christmas because her husband, Alfred, has rapidly advancing dementia or Alzheimer's. I forget which one it is. But lest I make the novel sound quaint, it is not. This is no Hallmark movie. This family is super fragmented. The entire book feels like you're presiding over a courtroom and you're the judge, and different family members keep getting called to the witness stand to tell their story. And you find yourself sympathizing with all of them and agreeing with them to some degree. And every single character in here is unique and compelling, even though I don't know if any of them are actually likable or totally likable. So the characters, there's Enid's husband, Alfred. He's an interesting character because he has this very grim, pessimistic worldview. He's a devotee of the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who was a 19th century German idealist. Very gloomy, very skeptical, almost a nihilistic quality to him. So the father is this engineer and inventor, and he's got this very dark German philosophy, and his dementia is getting worse, and everyone's been trying to deny it, but finally you can't deny it anymore. He is losing it. He's losing his mind. So there's Alfred's son, Chip. Chip is a city-dwelling hipster. He is a professor of critical theory and media studies at some college. He's obsessed. He's kind of a brat, and he's very smart, but also kind of a brat, and he's totally a mess. He's trying to get this screenplay published, but it's really he can't seem to get it finished because he's super distracted. He's having an affair with one of his students, just like in Disgrace, and so he gets fired from his job, and he's kind of a mess. There's Chip's brother, Gary, who is the total opposite of him. Gary is married, he has several children, and his wife is very intense. She has him reading her self-help books, and he's convinced he's depressed, and he's hiding alcohol from his wife. And at the same time, his wife and mother don't get along, so he's promised that she'll never have to go back to Minnesota again to see his mother, and yet his mother wants him to come home for Christmas. And he's also wealthy, and he's at the same time he's trying to find a cure for his ailing father by investing in this biotech company. So that's another whole side to this story. And then there's the third child, the sister, Denise, who is a professional chef and I think a lesbian, if I remember right. And she is probably, honestly, the least messed up and the most self-sufficient of the 3 children. But I'm kind of forgetting her character a little bit. So anyways, the characters are amazing. The story gets really good and super intense. Franzen takes you all over the world. There's an old person cruise that the 2 parents go on. There's the financial world. There's the world of brain research, and there's all sorts of illegal stuff going on. The plot gets very exciting and unexpected, and there are all sorts of twists as you follow these 4 different camps, and you get to see how their lives all converge and eventually come together. A total masterpiece, truly. All right, we've arrived at number 7, the Booker Award-winning novel Possession by A.S. Byatt. This is the Folio Society edition here. This is what I would call an intellectual adventure novel. You have the 2 main characters are Victorian literature scholars, a man and a woman, and they are studying the fictional Victorian poets R.H. Ashe and Christabel Lamotte. And what happens is they uncover a secret, highly scandalous relationship, an affair between the two poets, between Ash and Lamont, that was entirely covered up and lost to the world. So Possession is actually a split novel, in the sense that the story moves back and forth between the Victorian period with Ash and Lamont, and that story is told through letters, journals, and poems. And then there's a whole other story in the present, which in this case is the late 1980s, with the two scholars unearthing all these documents and tracking their subjects' movements from London to Yorkshire and slowly uncovering this relationship, from the spiritualist seances they attend to the forests that they haunt. So the story keeps moving backwards and forwards between the 1850s and 60s and the late 80s, and it keeps jumping in and out of these two worlds with their very different intellectual commitments, their different concerns. The theory culture in the 1980s versus the world of great turmoil in the Victorian period, with new theories of evolution, natural sciences, geology, and exploration, versus the more postmodern world of academia in the 1980s. But what's brilliant about this book is the way that Byatt knits these characters and weaves these two different narratives together. The whole novel is filled with the most authentic Victorian journal entries that Byatt just makes up whole cloth. I imagine that when a lot of people read this book, they are probably thinking that Ash and Lamont were real Victorian poets, just given how beautiful and compelling the letters and poems and journal entries are. And none of this is boring. It reads like a detective novel. Byatt is able to brilliantly and convincingly bring the Victorian period to life, and she is just brilliant at doing this. Truly a rare literary achievement here. Okay, number 6 on the list, we have All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. So this will be surprising to McCarthy fans. Most people tend to think of McCarthy's greatest novels as being Blood Meridian or Child of God or Suttree, maybe even The Road nowadays. The Road and No Country for Old Men are certainly the most widely read novels, I would imagine, but my favorite, and the one I would argue does not get enough attention, is All the Pretty Horses. People seem to forget that All the Pretty Horses actually won a National Book Award. This is a beautifully written novel, and I would argue this is McCarthy's most romantic, most adventurous novel, really a departure from anything he'd written before this book. And in fact, the book that he wrote right before this one was Blood Meridian. So if you know anything about that, just total brutality. But this happens to be the first book of McCarthy's that really sold well and led to his eventual mainstream success. So basically, this is the story of two friends down in the Texas Badlands, John Grady Cole and his best friend, Lacey Rollins, and they're like 16 or 17 years old. And so after John Grady realizes his family ranch has sold after a loved one dies, he and Lacey ride down across the border into Mexico in search of adventure and work. It's essentially these two don't want to just rot in their hometown. They have enterprising spirits and they want to go somewhere exotic in search of opportunity and excitement. They're young. There's a third boy, a third character who goes along with them. One of the most memorable characters I've ever read. Absolutely an insane, unstable mess of a human being. Jimmy Blevins, totally unforgettable character there. There is just something that is so off about Jimmy Blevins, but you'll see what I mean when you read this. And so the whole book reads like some sort of modern cowboy adventure. There's gunfights and prison scenes and campouts and discussions of God and lots of stuff with horses and descriptions of the souls of horses. The two of them get hired as ranch hands at this big sprawling ranch, and they spend several months breaking and training horses, and John Grady falls in love with the ranch owner's daughter. And so there's actually a plot line in here that's essentially a love story, which is a departure for Cormac McCarthy, and it's beautifully written through and through. And that's another thing I want to get to, speaking of beautifully written, is that quite possibly the most profound aspect of this book is just McCarthy's beautiful, rugged, terse, manly Faulknerian prose, right? His prose is just a chef's kiss. Perfect style for a cowboy novel. McCarthy has a stunning vocabulary for describing the natural world. You're just going to find some of the most beautiful, inspiring descriptions of nature you've ever read. Mesas and prairies and canyons and desert plains with storms overhead and plants and flowers and animals. I've never read an author that writes this entertainingly about nature, and part of that is because McCarthy spent most of his life down and around the Mexico, Texas, New Mexico border area, and so he knows a lot of Spanish, and he mixes the Spanish language in with the English here, and he just knows all about the flora and fauna and the wildlife down there. And I wanted to read you one quote from this just to give you a flavor of the type of sort of the routine writing in this. This isn't a particularly profound quotation here, but just to give you an example, quote, "They slumped bleary-eyed in their saddles and looked at one another. Shrouded in the black thunderheads, the distant lightning glowed mutely like welding seen through foundry smoke, as if repairs were underway at some flawed place in the iron dark of the world." So this is, again, a rare departure from McCarthy. There are almost no slow spots in this. This is a rip-rollicking adventure story / cowboy tale, and I think you guys are just going to love it. It is my personal McCarthy favorite. And here we are at number 5. We have Rabbit is Rich by John Updike. So this is the third book in John Updike's Rabbit tetralogy. I have the 4 novels here in this Everyman library. John Updike was a brilliant writer, maybe at a sentence level the best prose writer we've ever had, and he's certainly considered by many to be America's sort of last man of letters, someone who just wrote nonstop, published books of poetry, art criticism, short stories, and something like 30 novels. And really, all of Updike's novels were worth reading. Obviously, Updike is most famous for the Rabbit series, which is Rabbit Run, Rabbit Redux, Rabbit is Rich, and Rabbit at Rest. And I think there's a novella as well. So this series really aims to be a portrait of America. Updike said that his aim as a writer was to, quote, give the mundane its beautiful due, which is one of the things I just love about his fiction, as well as some of these other 20th century chroniclers of suburbia. I call this suburban fiction. So I'm thinking of Richard Ford, John Cheever, Richard Yates, Sinclair Lewis. By the way, Sinclair Lewis's title character, Babbitt, is almost certainly where Updike got the nickname for the main character here, Harry Rabbit Angstrom. When it comes to great American literary protagonists, many have argued that Rabbit is up there with Jay Gatsby, Huck Finn, Captain Ahab. So just one of the truly great American literary protagonists of all time. And Joyce Carol Oates writes this. She says, "The engine that drives the plot in John Updike's work is nearly always domestic. Men and women who might be called ordinary Americans of their time and place are granted an almost incandescent allure by the mysteries they present to one another." And that's it. That's exactly right. And again, my favorite of this tetralogy is Rabbit is Rich. And you might think, wow, book 3 of the Rabbit tetralogy, that's random. But Rabbit is Rich won the National Book Award, the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award when it came out in 1979. At this point in the series, it's 1979. Rabbit is middle-aged. He's living still in Brewer, Pennsylvania. He has inherited his wife's father's Toyota dealership, and he's finally starting to make good money, and his life is really starting to get comfortable. And yet, he's got problems too. His wife's drinking is getting out of control. His son is a screwed-up brat. And Harry himself is lusting after other women, and he thinks he has located who he believes to be his illegitimate daughter. And of course, his life is complicated. So I'm sure this doesn't sound like much of a story, but I'm telling you the brilliance and profundity of the Rabbit novels is in the observations and the character work and the use of language and just Rabbit's inner subjectivity, just the way in which Rabbit processes everything around him, the sights, the smells, the sounds, the whole social world of the aging late 20th century industrial east of the United States. So remember that Rabbit's story is always supposed to mirror what's kind of going on in the United States, and Rabbit is like an avatar for the sort of mainstream of America. And so it's never quite clear whether Updike is at any given moment critiquing Rabbit, celebrating him, feeling empathy for him. Just read it and see what I mean. This is just brilliant stuff, just brilliant writing. If you want to learn from a great prose stylist, you almost couldn't do better in the English language than John Updike. Okay, up next we have a kind of a similar jam here. We have Empire Falls by Richard Russo. So if you don't know about Richard Russo at this point, man, you are missing out. The best way I could describe him to you is that he's like a modern day Charles Dickens. Russo's prose is beautiful. He writes these long, gorgeous Dickensian sentences with such psychological depth and precision and penetration, and his characters are so complex, and he writes them with so much love and compassion. So basically, Richard Russo is well known for writing these tragicomedies about the lives of these small town ordinary blue-collar folks who usually live in some forgotten, left-behind Rust Belt town in New York or Maine or Ohio. And his books are all about these people's lives and their hopes and dreams and their loves and regrets. In my opinion, Empire Falls is Russo's best novel. It won a Pulitzer for what it's worth, and it's about this guy, Miles, who runs a diner. He lives in this town in Maine, and pretty much the entire town is owned by this crazy old widow lady, Francine Whiting, who has this Bond villain cat and is super rich. Not only does she own most of the buildings in town, but she also owns the diner where Miles works, and so she has this crazy hold over him and over his life, especially since she has promised to give him the diner when she dies. So the story is pretty obviously inspired by Dickens's Great Expectations. The old lady actually reminds me very much of Miss Havisham. There are a lot of parallels, actually, but this book is also quite different. So Miles is going through a divorce, and his ex-wife is actually a regular customer at the diner. So she's always coming in with her new fiance, who is like this tool bag gym owner. He's like a combination of White Goodman from Dodgeball and the uncle from Napoleon Dynamite. So that's a very awkward situation. Miles has a troubled younger brother, and he has a daughter named Tick. That's her nickname, and she is everything to him. And so a big part of this story is about the father-daughter relationship. So that's really sweet. And Miles just wants so much for his daughter, of course, but the place where they live is this Rust Belt town. The logging and textile mills have gone belly up. The real estate isn't worth much. The storefronts are boarded up. There's really no abundant industries or opportunities. The school kind of stinks. And so Miles has kind of been watching this place that he loves slowly die for years. And originally, Miles had to drop out of college to take care of his ailing mother, if I remember right, and he's then named the manager of this diner. And so that's kind of how he's gotten stuck in this town for the last 20 years, and he's been working under the promise that he'll be the owner of this diner, but he's beginning to suspect it's never going to happen. His father, meanwhile, is this loose cannon, irresponsible, drunken louse, but he's also one of the funniest, cleverest characters in the book. So anyways, the story is fantastic. It's filled with twists and turns and surprises. Unlike the Rabbit books, there's definitely a solid plot here. The Pulitzer Prize Committee actually describes the book this way: a decent man encircled by history and dreams, by echoing churches and abandoned mills, by the comforts and feuds provided by lifelong friends and neighbors. Miles is a patient, knowing guide to the rich, hard-scrabbled nature of Empire Falls. Fathers and sons and daughters, living and dead, rich and poor alike, shot through with the mysteries of generations and the shattering visitations of the nation at large. It is a social novel of panoramic ambition. So if you end up reading this and you want more, pretty much everything by Richard Russo is good. So of his work, I've read Empire Falls, obviously, Straight Man, and half of Nobody's Fool. And my wife has read Straight Man and That Old Cape Magic. Straight Man is one of the funniest books I've ever read. If you want to start with that one, that would make sense too. Okay, we're down to the final three, my top three favorite books of all time. And we're going to start with The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. So The Fountainhead is a book that I could read over and over again. In my humble opinion, it's Ayn Rand's best novel. I enjoyed Anthem and Atlas Shrugged very much, but as a novel, The Fountainhead was written before Ayn Rand had fully concretized her philosophy. And so to me, it makes for better art. It's less rigid. It's less dogmatic. The characters aren't necessarily mouthpieces for any one particular ideology. The story is graceful, and it really builds and builds. And Howard Rourke is one of the great heroes in all of literature. So Rand actually says in the preface that The Fountainhead is the story of how a moral man can live in a corrupt society. So the story is about this genius young architect named Howard Rourke, who's just starting out his career. And if you want a fuller summary of this, you can watch the review I did. It's pretty long. I'll link to it below. Howard Rourke wants to create bold new buildings in his own style, but the field of architecture is uninspired. It's stuck in the past. It's very protectionist. There's not much innovation going on. So the story starts as Rourke is getting kicked out of architecture school for refusing to learn the styles of the old masters and refusing to do projects and design buildings the way they want him to, because Rourke has this really fascinating philosophy about architecture and the way it should be done. He's acing his math and engineering classes, but the architecture classes are full of propaganda. They're all about social stuff and reinforcing this collectivist vision. So he gets kicked out and bums around as a construction worker until he's able to become a fledgling architect in New York City. And even then, it feels like there's nowhere to turn. Rourke is constantly having to sacrifice his aesthetic vision and his rational principles for a paycheck. And so the story is about this genius's long struggle to rise to prominence in a field dominated by groupthink and gatekeeping and corruption. And so Rourke is like Ayn Rand's version of an individualist hero who is trying to be an original, inspired creator in a time in society and in a media landscape that is bogged down by collectivism and bad ideas, that resents originality and despises the heroic individual in man. And so there's some great bad guy characters in here, and there's some romance as well. And along the way, Rourke meets other individuals who believe in his genius and his architectural style and want to help him uplift human greatness in an age when the mediocre is celebrated. So this book is just so inspiring and entertaining. One of the things I love about it is that Rand isn't afraid to give her readers an unapologetic hero to root for. So in a world in which people seem to only want to create and root for anti-heroes and morally gray characters, it is refreshing that Rand gives us an intransigent, righteous hero to root for, and a great man who refuses to sacrifice his vision and his moral vision and his aesthetic vision to anyone. He knows what is right, and he'll go down with the truth if he has to. And this book raises a very difficult and interesting question, which is it possible to live a life of complete and total authenticity, where you're not constantly having to compromise your values, where you're not constantly having to bend the knee? Can you make something of yourself without conforming to some degree? And Rand chooses the perfect vehicle for this in architecture. You wouldn't think a novel about architecture could even be exciting, but it turns out that when you have a book that is about one man trying to keep his integrity in a world of artificiality, you can then see how architecture is relevant, how the structural integrity of Rourke's buildings are in contrast to the ways that everyone else is doing things, and just the directness of Rourke's style and the powerful logic of his buildings and the way in which he lets the landscape and the purpose of the building dictate the way that the buildings should be constructed, that every building should have a theme, and that this goes with Rourke's philosophy of life as well. So anyways, the plot of The Fountainhead is great. The villains are fantastic. The writing is top-notch. Ayn Rand's best writing. If you want a book that will really make you think and will change the way you think about the world, check out The Fountainhead by Rand. Okay, up next, number 2, Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. There is not much I can say about Lord of the Rings to do it justice. I teach this to my students every year in a course I teach called Fantasy and Sci-Fi Literature. This is, this work follows a cast of beloved characters in a fantasy world that Tolkien created. These characters, Frodo, Sam, Gimli, Legolas, they are on a journey to destroy the Ring of Power. This book rests at the center. It is at the foundation of fantasy literature. Writers ever since J.R.R. Tolkien have been struggling to escape out from under his influence, right? Harold Bloom called this the anxiety of influence. This has been just the sort of ur-text of fantasy, in the same way that, say, the Iliad and the Odyssey have been ur-texts of Western literature. J.R.R. Tolkien said that he wrote these books to have a place, essentially, to put the languages that he had invented and created. I would say that that's the thing that is most special about J.R.R. Tolkien, is that here you have a rare writer, in contrast to many of the fantasy writers today, who starts from scratch and creates his own mythology from whole cloth. It's one of those things where only 5% really of what Tolkien created actually ends up on the page. So this is something that is drawing from deep wells, right? Brandon Sanderson once talked about the fact that when he's writing fantasy, he's building the world, and he feels like he's putting stepping stones just one step in front of the protagonist at a time. Like he doesn't actually know all of the details about the world until he gets into that point in the story, and he puts what he needs to be there. J.R.R. Tolkien created this world first and then wrote these books, and wrote them to take place in his highly original created worlds. Tolkien was a philologist, so he knew what he was talking about. He had translated Beowulf. He was a professor of Anglo-Saxon literature. He spoke and wrote and was a scholar of multiple languages. And so basically the foundations run really deep with this. This is the kind of book that you can read over and over and over again. It really is a modern classic. It is the most epic, the most fantastic voyage. And there's a reason we haven't been able to stop talking about Lord of the Rings ever since it was published in the 1950s. And I will say no more about this because you guys have all read it multiple times, and just know it is number 2. It is a close second on this list. All right, that just leaves number 1, the number 1 book on this list, what I consider to be my favorite novel of all time, and that is, drum roll please, that is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. So I consider this is a collection of Barnes & Noble Classics collection of 5 Dickens novels: Oliver Twist, Tale of Two Cities, David Copperfield, Christmas Carol, Great Expectations. Very beautiful there. But Charles Dickens is my all-time favorite novelist. I'm not even sure I can quantify why. I'm not even sure I can explain it rationally. After I graduated from high school and when I really started getting into reading, Dickens was like my Bible. It was like my bedside. He was like my bedside companion. He is the author that I dove into and spent the most time with. And he's the author that made me fall in love with literature. Great Expectations, David Copperfield, A Christmas Carol, Bleak House, Tale of Two Cities, hard times, these books made me want to become an English teacher. Great Expectations is a brilliant work. It is gothic. It has that Dickensian feel, that sort of Bildungsroman quality to it. Many of Dickens' stories are coming-of-age stories, and as you know, they're often about orphans or children whose parents have passed away, or main characters who are in some way down on their luck and who have to make their way in a world that is cruel. And Dickens has so much compassion for his characters. Dickens's intellect was so powerful. His writing was so psychologically penetrating and astute. The unforgettable characters that he created in Great Expectations alone. We're talking about Magwitch and Pip and Miss Havisham and the femme fatale Estella and Joe the blacksmith and Pip's sister, very cruel woman. And so really briefly, Great Expectations is about an orphan boy who has been raised by his sister and her husband, the blacksmith Joe Gargery. Pip is intelligent and thoughtful and reflective and talented, but he is lower class, and by all expectations, he is going to spend his life as a blacksmith, and he is going to live in the marshes of England, and he's going to have a very mundane, very normal lower class existence as a blacksmith, and that is his future. Well, one day he realizes that he has a benefactor, and he spends the rest of the novel trying to figure out who this benefactor is. Someone comes to Pip and says, there is someone who has decided to set you up in London to become a gentleman, and who has decided to change your life forever. And it's a secret. Pip doesn't know who his benefactor is. He has certain guesses. He thinks it might be Miss Havisham. He thinks it might be this convict that he ran into and that he did a favor for, and who was arrested in front of him. He thinks it might be, someone else, maybe this lawyer that he's met. And so it's one of those magical experiences similar to My Fair Lady, where you get to watch a street urchin child make something great of themselves. And it's one of those just magical transformation stories where a character goes from being lowly and downtrodden to being someone who is to be respected. But this is also a story about class differences, right? And the way in which class impacts us and the way that it shapes our psyches, what it's like growing up poor versus what it's like to grow up as a gentleman, how the expectations are different. And one of the lessons that you learn here is the way in which wealth changes people. And so this is a story of growth. Pip, by the end of the novel, comes to understand what money does to people. This is also a love story. It's also a gothic, romantic love story. Much of this is about the way in which people who raise us have such a deep and intractable influence on us that we can never quite shake off. So the woman that Pip falls in love with, the girl that Pip falls in love with, is Estella. Estella was raised in a haunted Gothic mansion by Miss Havisham, and Miss Havisham is someone who has her own secrets and her own tragic circumstances, and so those rub off on Estella. And Estella is someone who may never be able to love someone and may never be able to love Pip the way he wants her to. And so this is just a novel with tremendously great characters. This is Dickens's best paced novel. It is his best plotted novel. I was very tempted to put David Copperfield in the number one position. That might even eke out Great Expectations for me. But this book had such a vast and great influence on my life. I cannot ever shake it, and I've read it now, probably six 6 or 7 times. I taught it for a few years. Great Expectations is, in my view, it is the novel that is closest to my heart. I will never get sick of reading it. All right, so that's it. We're going to wrap it up. Follow us on Facebook, Goodreads, Tip Your Starving Booktuber on Patreon, and until next time, happy reading.